My name is Evelyn Vance. I am 42 years old, and for 18 years I have worked as a senior forensic accountant and certified fraud examiner, which means when corporations conceal offshore accounts or family trusts mysteriously lose six figures overnight, I am the person courts hire to trace the paper trail down to the ink weight and the exact millisecond of a bank routing transfer. 3 hours before my sister's engagement gala at the Bellevue Manor, I sat in a dimly lit corner booth in the venue's lounge and calculated the two numbers I was about to write on the back of a silk napkin and what my sister's hidden bank account was about to reveal to 40 dinner guests 15 minutes later. Welcome back to our final chapter, where every story starts with silence and ends with power. If you've ever been asked to pay for a betrayal you didn't commit, this one's for you. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. The rain was coming down in long gray sheets against the window of the manor, but inside, the crystal chandeliers were glowing like everything in my family was perfectly fine. I've spent nearly 2 decades auditing balance sheets, tracing hidden assets, and reading financial fraud like an open book. When you spend that much time examining transaction histories, you start viewing the world in ledgers. I know how people lie on paper, how they hide wire transfers, and how greed always leaves a digital footprint, no matter how clever someone thinks they are. My quirk, if you want to call it that, is that I can't look at a piece of formal paper without reflexively checking its weight, font alignment, and watermarks. Give me a restaurant receipt, an embossed invitation, or a bank slip, and within 3 seconds I've unconsciously verified whether the routing layout matches standard banking conventions. My closest friend Sarah calls it my terminal auditor brain. It's a habit born from years of staring at altered documents under magnification. It was never meant to be used at a family dinner. It was about to be the only reason I didn't end up taking the fall for a $42,000 fraud scheme planned by my own blood. My family had always operated on a different kind of accounting. Growing up outside of Stamford, my mother, Eleanor, viewed appearance as currency and truth as a flexible suggestion. My younger sister, Chloe, was 4 years younger, endlessly doted on, and raised with the absolute conviction that her desires were obligations the rest of the world owed her. When my father passed away 4 years ago, leaving behind a small cedar shingle home and a complex modest estate, Eleanor and Chloe absorbed every physical asset within 6 months. I received my father's old oak roll-top desk, his books, and his quiet memory. I didn't fight them. I had my career, my quiet townhouse, and my peace. The phone call came on a Tuesday night in late October. Rain was tapping against my kitchen window while I worked through a complex corporate probate audit. The caller ID displayed my mother's name, a vision of sharp elegance and calculated charm that usually meant an impending request. "Evelyn, darling," Eleanor's voice filtered through the speaker, layered with that soft, performative warmth she reserved for moments when she needed something framed as a privilege. "Chloe's engagement dinner is this Thursday at Bellevue Manor. Just a small, intimate gathering. Just the 4 of us and a few close friends to celebrate her future with Julian." I leaned back in my chair, holding my pen still over my ledger. "Mother, Chloe and I haven't spoken since she cleared out Dad's workshop before the probate closed." Eleanor sighed, a delicate practice sound of maternal exhaustion. "That was years ago, Evelyn. We have to move past these petty accounting grievances. She wants her sister there. We need to be unified. After all, it's all for family. It's all for family." Those 4 words had been my mother's favorite currency my entire life. She used them when she asked me to sign over my college savings fund to cover Chloe's private high school tuition. She used them when she asked me to pretend I hadn't seen the altered receipts in my father's desk after his business went under. It was a simple, quotable phrase designed to make boundary setting look like treason. To understand why those 4 words made my chest tighten, you have to go back to October 2022, 2 weeks after my father's funeral. My father, Arthur, had been a quiet man who spent 40 years running a modest hardware supply store. He wasn't rich, but he was meticulous. When he died, the estate showed a net value of $450,000, along with a quiet, restricted annuity meant to mature on my 45th birthday. Within 18 months of his death, Eleanor and Chloe had liquidated the store's inventory, sold the cedar shingle house for $320,000, and managed to exhaust every cent of the liquid funds on luxury travel, designer wardrobes, and lease payments on vehicles they couldn't afford. When the local tax authorities issued a $14,000 property tax lien on the estate's remaining land, Eleanor didn't call a financial planner. She called me at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, demanding I cover the tax bill immediately because I was the one with the high corporate salary. When I refused to pay, without reviewing the estate's complete tax returns first, Chloe called me a cold, calculating bean counter who cared more about receipts than her father's legacy. They cut me off for 14 months. They didn't invite me to Thanksgiving. They didn't call on my 41st birthday. I want to be honest about the part of me that isn't cold or analytical. The reason I didn't hang up the phone on Tuesday night wasn't because I believed Eleanor had changed. It was because my house was very quiet that evening. My father's desk sat in the corner of my home office, smelling faintly of old cedar and pipe tobacco, and a pathetic, unspoken part of me still wished that my mother loved me for who I was, rather than what I could audit or finance. I wanted to believe, just for one night, that an invitation to my sister's engagement was actually about me being her sister. The next morning, I had coffee with Sarah at a small cafe 3 blocks from my office. Sarah was a senior partner at a civil litigation firm, a woman who had seen every variation of familial dysfunction play out in probate courtrooms. She watched me stir my black coffee for 3 full minutes before she set her own cup down with a sharp click against the saucer. "Evelyn, listen to me very carefully," Sarah said, her voice dropping into that blunt, razor-sharp tone she used when cross-examining hostile witnesses. "Snakes don't change their skin just because it's dinner time. You're walking into a slaughterhouse with a silk napkin on your lap. Eleanor doesn't call you to share dinner. She calls you when a bill is due that she can't pay herself." "It's just a dinner, Sarah," I lied quietly, staring into my coffee. "She said it's just the 4 of us and a few friends. If Eleanor Vance tells you it's raining, you look out the window twice and check the radar," Sarah replied flatly. "Don't go. Or if you go, leave your checkbook, your credit cards, and your sentimentality at home." I went anyway. Some doors you keep walking back through even when you know the floor on the other side has been pulled away, simply because you need to prove to yourself that you're strong enough to stand on the frame. I arrived at Bellevue Manor at precisely 6:30 on Thursday evening. The manor was an imposing stone estate converted into an exclusive private club, surrounded by manicured hedges and slick, rain-soaked asphalt. The first gap between what was promised and what was real hit me the moment I stepped past the uniformed valet. Eleanor had told me this was an intimate gathering, just the 4 of us and a few close friends. But as the host led me toward the grand conservatory room, I counted 40 guests standing under soaring vaulted ceilings, sipping champagne beneath floral archways that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. This wasn't a family dinner. It was a high-stakes catered gala. I stood near the entrance, scanning the crowd, and immediately my eyes began taking inventory of the physical contrasts in the room, the sharp, telltale differences between performed wealth and actual solvency. My sister Chloe was standing near the center of the room, wearing an ivory silk designer gown that still had the faint crease marks of an expedited alterations tag. She was holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne, laughing loudly with Julian's wealthy relatives. But as she raised her hand to push a strand of hair behind her ear, my eyes locked onto her wrist. She was wearing a heavy gold luxury watch, but the deployment clasp was slightly misaligned, and the leather band showed the distinct wear patterns of a second-hand consignment item. Beside her, Eleanor was draped in a tailored velvet blazer. But as she set her glass on a tray, I caught sight of her leather handbag sitting on a side table. The leather was pristine, but the gold-plated zipper pull was tarnished and held to the interior lining by a tiny silver safety pin. They were performing a multi-$1,000 spectacle on a foundation that was fraying at the edges. "Oh, Evelyn," a voice drawled from my left. It was my Aunt Beatrice, holding a plate of seared scallops. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my simple black wool trousers and tailored charcoal silk blouse. "Nice to see you out of your spreadsheets for once. I see you're still wearing off the rack." I suppose forensic accounting doesn't pay quite as well as Julian's private equity firm. I offered a polite, measured smile. It pays enough for me to know the difference between ownership and debt, Aunt Beatrice. She blinked, slightly thrown, before turning away to join another conversation. That was the first brick. Stay with me, because what happened next, I planned in the time it takes to dry your hands. 10 minutes later, as I moved toward the bar to order a sparkling water, Julian, Chloe's fiancé, stepped into my path. He was 35, wore a suit that fit a little too tight around the shoulders, and carried the unmistakable air of a man who believed loud confidence was a substitute for liquidity. "Evelyn!" he chuckled, clapping a hand onto my shoulder with entirely too much force. "Glad you could make it out of the vault. We were just talking about the bar tab. Evelyn's the designated bill payer tonight, right? Someone's got to fund the luxury standard when the family gathers." A few people nearby chuckled politely. My pulse stayed entirely steady, but my mind was already shifting gears, filing the comment away into a growing ledger of red flags. That was the second brick. Around 7:15, I excused myself to use the restroom, navigating down a long carpeted hallway lined with brass sconces. Near the coat alcove at the end of the corridor, I heard hushed, urgent voices echoing from behind a partially closed mahogany door. "She's here, Eleanor. Have you talked to her yet?" It was Chloe's voice, sharp, thin, and entirely devoid of the cheerful lilt she'd been using in the main room. "Not yet," Eleanor's voice replied, quiet but fierce. "She just got here. Let her have a drink first. If you push her now, she'll get defensive." "We don't have time for her to have a drink," Chloe hissed. "The venue manager already came to the dressing room twice before the guests arrived. He said the deposit draft bounced this morning. If the balance isn't settled by 9 o'clock, he's locking the bar and shutting down the main dining service in front of Julian's parents." "Keep your voice down," Eleanor snapped. "The annuity transfer cleared into the holding account on Monday. We just need Evelyn to sign off as the surviving co-trustee on the authorization form so the bank releases the final $42,000 to Bellevue Manor. She's not going to ruin your engagement night. She cares too much about what people think." "She cares about her stupid books," Chloe spat. "Evelyn always did prefer money to family. Let's see if she finally puts her money where her mouth is, when everyone is standing right there." I stood in the quiet carpeted hallway, the cool air settling into my lungs. My father's restricted annuity. The one mature on my 45th birthday. The one that required 2 signatures to touch, mine and Eleanor's. I didn't enter the room. I walked quietly into the ladies' room, turned on the cold water faucet, and held my wrists under the stream until the chill settled into my bones. Then I pulled my phone from my clutch, logged into my secure probate database portal, and pulled up the state corporate and trust registry. It took me less than 90 seconds to find it. 3 weeks ago, an electronic signature authorization had been submitted to the trust bank, purporting to carry my consent to liquidate $42,500 from Arthur Vance's restricted estate account to satisfy urgent estate administrative fees. Attached to the digital filing was a scanned PDF of my father's original trust schedule, bearing my signature at the bottom. Except the signature wasn't mine. It was a crude, digitized trace of my signature taken from my father's funeral guest book, pasted onto a fraudulent authorization form. They hadn't just invited me to a dinner. They had forged my signature to steal from my father's trust. The transaction had been flagged for fraud verification by the bank's automated system. The venue's draft had bounced, and now they needed me to physically sign a manual override slip in front of the venue manager to release the stolen funds before the party fell apart. When I dried my hands with a paper towel, smoothed down my charcoal blout into the grand conservatory. As I re-entered the room, my mother caught my eye from across the floral display. She glided toward me, holding a small decorative leather folder tucked under her arm. Her expression was a masterclass in performative maternal warmth, but beneath the foundation, her skin was pale and her eyes were darting toward the manor manager, who was standing by the entrance holding a black clipboard. Eleanor reached out, placing her hand gently on my forearm. "Evelyn, sweetie," she murmured, her voice dripping with artificial tenderness. "Come stand near the front. We're about to do the toasts, and we need you right next to Chloe. After all, it's all for family." That was the second time she said it. The second time she handed me those 4 words like a leash. As I walked toward the front of the room, my sister Chloe looked over at me. Her jaw was set, her eyes hard, her chin raised in a silent, arrogant challenge. She truly believed that surrounded by 40% influential guests in front of her wealthy future in-laws, I would be too embarrassed, too polite, and too intimidated to say anything other than yes. At 8:45, the venue's head manager, a tall gray-haired man named Mr. Harrison, wearing a sharp tuxedo, stepped to the side of the head table. He didn't look happy. His eyes were fixed firmly on Eleanor. Chloe clinked her butter knife against her crystal champagne glass. The high, ringing tone echoed across the vaulted ceiling, bringing the 40 guests to a quiet hush. "Everyone, thank you so much for coming tonight," Chloe began, beaming at Julian, who stood beside her looking slightly flushed from the open bar before we served the main course. "My mother wants to say a few words about the foundation of our family." Eleanor stepped forward, holding her glass high. She gave a breathtaking, polished speech about heritage, loyalty, and the sacred bond between mothers, daughters, and sisters. She spoke about my father with practiced grief, dabbing a non-existent tear from the corner of her eye. "And tonight," Eleanor said, turning her head to look directly at me as the crowd smiled warmly, "we are so blessed to have my eldest daughter, Evelyn, here with us. Evelyn has always been the anchor of our family's finances, the one who keeps us grounded." Eleanor reached into her leather folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a red-flagged bank manual authorization form, along with a polished silver pen. She didn't hand it to me privately. She held it out right in front of Julian's parents, right in front of Aunt Beatrice, right in front of the venue manager who stepped forward with his clipboard. "Evelyn, darling," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, loud enough for every single guest to hear. "The manor manager just needs your final administrative sign-off on the event trust draft, so we can proceed with the main dinner service. Just sign the line, Evelyn. It's all for family." There it was, the third and final delivery. Short, quotable, weaponized, and delivered like a public execution disguised as a sisterly duty. The entire room went dead quiet. 40 pairs of eyes shifted from Eleanor to me. Julian's mother smiled expectantly. Aunt Beatrice leaned forward. Mr. Harrison, the manager, stood waiting with his pen ready. I didn't flinch. I didn't flush red. I didn't raise my voice. I let the silence sit. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. 5 full seconds stretched across the room until the air felt so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. Eleanor's performative smile began to freeze at the corners. Chloe's hand gripped her champagne glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. "No," I said quietly. The word was small, but in that vaulted room it sounded like a glass vase shattering on marble. Eleanor blinked, her voice dropping into a strained, forceful whisper while keeping her smile pasted on her face. "Evelyn, don't be ridiculous. It's just the venue transfer form. Just sign it so Mr. Harrison can clear the kitchen." "I am not signing that form, Mother," I said, my voice smooth, measured, and perfectly amplified for the entire room to hear. "And Mr. Harrison should know that the reason the original electronic draft bounced this morning is because it was submitted using a forged signature stolen from my father's memorial guest book 3 weeks ago." Gasps rippled through the front row of guests. Julian's father frowned deeply, setting his glass down on the table. Chloe took a sharp step forward, her face turning bright crimson. "What are you talking about?" she yelled, abandoning all pretense of elegance. "You're lying. She's trying to ruin my engagement because she's bitter and jealous. She's always hated me." "I am a certified fraud examiner, Chloe," I said calmly, pulling a slim leather folder from my handbag and opening it on the head table right next to her floral arrangement. "I don't deal in jealousy, I deal in paper trails." I pulled out 3 high-resolution printed sheets and laid them flat under the chandelier lights. "This is the digital authorization form submitted to the trust bank on October 12th. I said, pointing to the first sheet, as Mr. Harrison leaned over to look. Notice the digital timestamp and the IP address attached to the submission. It originates from the wireless router registered to your home address, Chloe. That doesn't prove anything, Chloe stammered, her voice cracking as she looked wildly around the room at her guests. Anyone could have used my Wi-Fi. Let's look at the second sheet, I continued, my voice entirely unhurried, as if I were conducting a standard corporate board audit. This is a microscopic magnification of the signature on the form compared to my actual signature on my state license. The signature on your form has a pixelation artifact on the loop of the V, an exact match to the ink bleed from the gel pen I used at Dad's funeral memorial service. It was scanned, cropped, and pasted. Eleanor's face went completely ash-white. She reached out to grab the papers, her hands trembling violently. Evelyn! Stop this right now. This is a private family matter. You are humiliating your sister in front of her guests. She tried a second time to grab the folder from my hands, knocking a water glass over. The glass shattered against a bread plate, ice cubes spilling across the white linen table. You're making a scene over nothing, Eleanor shouted, her voice shrill and desperate as several of Julian's relatives stepped back in visible disgust. It's our family's money anyway. Your father left that estate for all of us. Dad left that restricted account with explicit terms that require my legal consent, I replied, standing tall, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. And you attempted to commit federal bank fraud to cover a $42,000 party you couldn't afford, hoping you could force me to sign a retroactive waiver under the pressure of public embarrassment. Chloe tried a third time to save the narrative. She burst into hysterical, loud sobs, throwing her arms around Julian's neck. Julian, tell her to stop. She's making it all up. She fabricated those sheets. She wants to destroy us. Julian looked at his fiancée, then down at the magnified signature sheets on the table, then over at Mr. Harrison, whose expression had turned from polite impatience to grim, professional severity. So he unclasped Chloe's hands from his suit jacket and took a full step away from her. Eleanor grabbed my arm, her nails digging into the fabric of my sleeve, her face twisted in a mixture of rage and terror. "You do this to your own family," she hissed, her voice vibrating with malice. "After everything I gave you, you owe us your loyalty." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then looked her straight in the eyes with a calm, cold clarity that made her fingers slowly loosen and drop away. "I don't owe you," I said softly, every word echoing in the silent room. "I never did." The fallout was immediate, precise, and completely devoid of the theatrical drama Eleanor had spent her life cultivating. Mr. Harrison picked up the printed audit sheets from the table, folded them neatly, and turned to my sister. "Miss Vance," he said in a flat, icy tone, "Bellevue Manor requires the total event balance to be settled via certified funds within 10 minutes. Or we will immediately escort all guests off the premises and contact the municipal police department regarding the bounced fraudulent draft." Julian's parents didn't wait for the 10 minutes to expire. Without saying a single word to Eleanor or Chloe, Julian's father picked up his wife's coat, signaled to his family, and walked out of the grand conservatory. Julian stood there for 30 seconds, looking at Chloe's tear-streaked face, before turning on his heel and following his parents into the rain. Within 20 minutes, the grand conservatory was empty. The 40 guests vanished like smoke, leaving behind half-filled champagne glasses, cold appetizers, and the deafening silence of a ruined performance. Eleanor and Chloe were forced to sign a personal confession of debt and execute an emergency promissory note using Chloe's luxury vehicle as collateral, just to prevent the venue from filing immediate criminal charges that night. The engagement was officially canceled by Friday afternoon, because the bank fraud involved an interstate electronic transfer. The trust bank's compliance department opened a formal inquiry. I did not press additional private charges, but I refused to sign any retroactive waivers. The bank froze the remaining administrative funds, placing the trust under strict court-monitored third-party administration, effectively cutting Eleanor and Chloe off from every cent of my father's remaining assets forever. 2 weeks after the dinner, I was sitting at my father's old oak desk in my home office. The house was quiet, the autumn leaves blowing past the window outside. I was organizing some old probate files when I noticed a small, thick manila envelope tucked into the very back of the desk's lowest drawer, a hidden compartment I hadn't noticed during the initial move. Inside was a handwritten letter from my father, dated 6 months before his death. The handwriting was slanted and slightly shaky, written in his familiar dark blue fountain pen ink. My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it means you have likely had to open this desk to fix something that was broken. I know how your mother and sister operate. I spent 30 years pretending not to see the balance sheets they tried to rewrite. I let them push you into the background because you were strong and quiet and they were loud and demanding. That was my greatest failure as a father. I created the restricted annuity not just to protect the money, but to give you a key that only you could turn. I knew a day would come when they would demand you burn yourself to keep them warm. I am writing this to tell you that you have my full permission to say no. You do not owe them your life, your honesty, or your peace. Stand your ground, my clever girl. Your integrity is the only true inheritance I leave behind that nobody can ever steal from you. With all my love, Dad. I held the paper against my chest for a long time, listening to the rain tap against the glass, feeling the cold weight of 4 years of unspoken grief finally lift from my shoulders. Forgiveness is a quiet gift you give yourself to clear your own ledger. But trust is an invoice that must be paid in advance with truth. That's my story. If it meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me. I read every one. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe to our final chapter, because there's another one waiting for you next week.